I was actively praying to the darkness, give me power, you can have my life, do whatever, right? And so that happens. It shows up to the degree that there were times where people who were not on drugs the next morning said, hey, what was the dark shadow in the room that had that big coat and a top hat? Like, what was that? It freaked us out.
Caleb Parette reached a place in his life where anything was fair game in his quest for emotional security and ultimately power. It wouldn't be long before the stage would be set for a spiritual war that'll blow your mind. Welcome to A Stronger Faith, a podcast that places you in the heart of the experiences that changed people's faith, their understanding of God, and the trajectory of their lives. I'm your host, Stacy McCants, and we pray that God stirs you more strongly toward Him through this conversation. We would love for you to participate with us by praying that God uses this podcast to draw people to Himself. We'd also love to hear about your story of faith, or maybe somebody you know who might make a great guest. To do that, visit astrongerfaith.com and click the button on the home page that says, Recommend a Guest. We love hearing from our listeners. Today, Caleb Parette joins us to share the intense details of his spiritual war and how God pulled him out. Please meet Caleb Parette. So, I'm in Dallas, Texas, with Caleb Parette, and Caleb and I got introduced through a mutual friend. This guy's name is Chris Peterson, and he right away said, hey, look, you need to talk to my friend Caleb. I was like, okay, well, tell me why. He said, well, I'm going to send you a link. I want you to watch this. And it was the Ask documentary. And you and I have been talking for, it seems like, months. Mm-hmm. And it suddenly, last week, worked out where our calendars aligned for me to be in Dallas today and you to be in Dallas today. And so here we are. I mean, this time last week, we had no idea that this would be, and so this week, here we are. And so it's pretty amazing how God works those things out. And so thank you for doing this, and welcome.
No, well, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I've watched a few interviews you've done, and I've gotten to know more and more about this background and this story. And it's a story of God's pretty profound presence breaking in, especially or specifically through addiction and recovery.
Yes. I mean, I would say that's a large component of it. And I would say furthermore that it was God, it was like God really showing off in a way, I would say, because of how drastically He intervened relative not only to the addiction part of things, but I would say on a spiritual level, spiritual warfare, just how chains were broken, and I do mean that very seriously. That, when I got sober, I had the blessing of many wiser older men in my life for a long time. Now, did I listen to them? Not so much, right? But my dad had a lot of friends who really cared about me and really mature Christians, walk the walk. So by the time I was ready to change, there was already a network of people that were there ready to help, waiting for me to kind of come to that conclusion. And there's a gentleman that basically he was talking to his mentor, and he said, hey, Caleb Parette got sober, right? He got a couple days sober, and this other guy said, hey, that's great and all, but what I understand from his story is that with the spiritual darkness that he was involved in, getting sober's great. He's not going to stay sober unless that's dealt with. And so there is a duality to, yes, the addiction part of it, but then also a spiritual deliverance that came on the back end of that when I was a couple days sober, that hard to put into words what that was like. And so I guess we'll attempt some of that today.
Yeah,
I
want to get into that for sure. We talked about this morning, and as we were getting set up and that sort of thing, but I've had I don't know, 4 or 5 maybe people that are recovering addicts. And in each of the cases, it's probably some of the most profound breaking into the natural world of God stories I've ever heard.
Yeah.
Because I think it's just such a dramatic spiritual battle that takes place there.
Yeah.
And I don't know the specifics of all that stuff, but when I get into conversations of people who have been in recovery and it's been these wild stories, they come in and sometimes they're like hesitant to give some of the details because they're going to sound like they're crazy because of the stuff because it's not stuff that you see in the world, right?
No, absolutely. That there is that level of trepidation relative to being authentic because it can be seemingly so out of left field.
Yeah.
That you're like, okay.
So we're going to get that people get into these situations over time or abruptly or whatever, and it's important to kind of get a little bit of a background. And you've got a faith background too. It's not just the background that was some of the foundations before that were set to begin to establish an addiction, but you had early experience in faith as well. So probably should probably start from there and say, okay, give me a little bit of the backstory of what growing up was like and things that may have contributed to sort of both sides of it, both your addiction and your spiritual evolution.
Sure. I have had some incredible experiences. I consider myself very fortunate to have grown up overseas. I grew up in China, and why I say fortunate is that I really cherish the fact that I have had exposure to multiple cultures and multiple types of people, multiple languages. There's a fullness that I think I experience in life that comes from that, being able to, in a multifaceted sense, connect with people. And so, I was born in Hong Kong, and I lived in China until I was about 17. My parents came to Hong Kong to have me in a British hospital at the time, and then moved back into China. And I was there till I was 2 or 3, and came back to the U.S. for about a year or so. And my parents moved back to they moved back to China with 4 kids under the age of 4.
Yeah, but your parents aren't Chinese, so they are missionaries.
Correct. And, you'd never put that on a resume. So at the time, they went back to, quote-unquote, teach English.
Okay.
You have to have a cover job in order to do mission work, if you will. And
but American parents.
From Arkansas, Little Rock, and Fayetteville, Arkansas.
Okay. And they were doing work in China.
Correct.
And so when you say you were born in China and you've got siblings or whatever, you're not native to China.
Oh, yeah, no.
Yeah.
I'm a white guy. to put it simply.
You sound like a white guy. You look like a white guy. Yeah. Go ahead.
And so when we moved back to China after that 1 year, when they went back with 4 kids under the age of 4, it was to a very small, relatively small town. And in American terms, it'd probably be a huge population, but in China, it was a small town. And we were the only foreign family there, and my parents were just trying to find ways to be helpful. And so one of the things that eventually came about after they were teaching English there for a while is that they discovered that there was an orphanage down the road from us, literally down the road from us. And so they started doing a lot of work there. And over time, that evolved into some really cool stuff where my dad has and mom have helped set up different foster circles and rehabilitation programs for handicapped kids, and also a special care room for premature babies or babies that are born with defects. And so that really has evolved and grown over the years. I would say in the beginning, though, you could say it was a bit darker and a bit messier. I probably, at a very young age, I saw things that no child should have experience with, relative to just how dark and depraved the world can be, right? When you see the suffering of the innocent at a young age, I think that began to jade my heart, and at a very early age.
And this was related to the work they were doing, or just living in China?
No, just mainly the work they were doing. I mean, there were other facets of the living in China part, of course, being the only Caucasian there for years and years.
I saw a video of you guys going through the market. You know, you got this blonde hair, and everybody is looking and staring because they just haven't seen a person like that before.
For the longest time, literally anywhere I went, there was a crowd of people just watching me.
Yeah.
And my sisters, my family. And over time that changed as kind of the westernization of China has occurred. Now it is so different than what it used to be. And I miss a lot of what it used to be. But, yeah, so being the only white kid over there, there was certainly a sense of, where do I belong? And there's a coined term called a third culture kid, which I don't know if you've heard of, but essentially it's used to describe children that are of a native culture that go to another culture and are not fully part of either culture.
Yeah.
And that can be military, missionary, it can be, traveling families, whatever it is. But the idea that you're kind of your own identity in a lot of ways because you don't fully assimilate on either side.
You're not included, right? You're always an outsider to some degree.
Well, and it's more internal, honestly, because I was included in a lot of things down the road. I think it was more of an insecurity.
Yeah.
In what is home? Where is safe?
Mm-hmm.
What is okay? From a very young age, I strive to feel a sense of I'm okay. I'm safe. Because I learned early on that the world is not safe. And so with third culture kids, there's ups and downs too. I think the cool thing is you learn to get along with all types of people.
Yeah.
And that's been one of the biggest blessings in my life now, even with my career, is that, doing international business, I can go anywhere and to some degree I'll be able to connect with people, and that's been, I love that part of it. The parts of it that I think are a bit disconnecting are the fact that I don't know that I'll ever feel fully American, and I don't know that I'll ever feel fully Chinese. So there is an identity issue there that you kind of go, okay, what am I, right?
Right.
And, now as someone who's older, you can parse through it in your mind and kind of, organize it and think about it. But I think without having linear thought as much when you're younger, it just whirls into emotion.
Yeah.
And so I would say those emotions from an early age trended towards fearfulness and a sense of abandonment in some degrees, because it always felt like, one, the family mission was more important as a whole than the individual members of the family, but also at the same time, our extended family in the U.S., I didn't get to connect with them as much. So I started to learn to tend to my own feelings very early, and that is a key part of what I think we'll touch on today, because that simple phrase right there really is what is it turns the key for the whole addiction process. Is I started to manage my own feelings.
When?
I would say I started to manage my own feelings at around 9 or 10 years old.
And you also have Christian parents who are doing Christ-centered work.
Correct.
What is your understanding of God? How is it shaping up during all of this?
So that's a great question, because I think, the most beautiful thing happened to me the other day, Stacy. I got a call, and my little 4-year-old was on the video call. She said, "Daddy, today I became a Christian." And, I've teared up a couple times since then thinking about just the mercy that God has shown me, that and the blessing of being able to hear that as a father. I'm tearing up right now because the depth and weight of that is just, it's so powerful on many levels, right? And so my mom must have felt the same way when I was 5 years old, because I remember distinctly missing my family. I remember missing my grandparents, right? And just crying and just, why are we here? And, Mom came in bedtime and just shared about God and how he's there for us, and, you know, how he loves us, and he sees that we're hurting. And we talked some, and I prayed to receive Christ when I was 5. And I think that it was probably one of the biggest single saving graces through everything, because I think that tether, whether it was a thread or not, at times, likely kept me alive, was the presence of the Holy Spirit, even though it had been snuffed down to almost nothing for a long time. I think that really, I got saved then, right? But then it also kept me alive till I was 24 and really had a breakthrough with my relationship with God. So I would say that how I viewed God then is like, okay, he does care. All right, I can put my faith in that. And there was a general sense of like, this is right, and I want to, obey God, and I want to, just very simplistic things for, a 5 to 8-year-old to think. I think where that began to change was when I started to experience pain. Whether it was pain of loss, pain of change. We moved back to the U.S. when I was, I think, 10, 11 years old. We came back for 1 year for a furlough. And everything that I ever felt prior got stirred up again, because now I had my roots in China, right? And so now we moved back here to the U.S. and to rural Arkansas. I went to school for 9 weeks at a public school, and that was absolute train wreck. And I felt disconnected. I felt, those kids had never met anybody that came from China. So I really started to experience pain at that time.
Was it just bullying and not fitting in, or just not?
Sure.
It's just not your people?
Sure. Bullying, not fitting in, just not a sense of belonging. Just always the oddball out, if you will.
Well, I mean, you're 10 years old. What is that? 5th grade?
Yeah, 5th grade.
Yeah, so they've been together for a few years, and here comes the new kid. And that's tough.
So I think that was kind of a pivotal moment. It was experiencing pain. Because addicts, we don't have a very high tolerance for pain.
Yeah.
Our bandwidth to endure pain is very, very low. Now, looking back now, I could show you key metrics from just either psychological or just from addiction point of view that would show that, hey, the precursor for addiction was already there with me. There were a lot of telltale signs, right? Because I drank Coca-Cola at the age of 12, almost alcoholically.
Really?
Because, it made me feel good. So that I do want to touch on that, because when I started experiencing pain at 10, I started to figure out ways where I could not experience pain. Video games, Coca-Cola, whatever it was. So by the time I was 14, we'd moved back to China when I was 12 to a new city, so another upheaval. And then I'd gone through 2 years of international school. It was a Filipino international school. None of the white kids there could speak Chinese, and they weren't integrated into the Chinese culture. So yet again, the odd man out. And, throughout all this time, I couldn't name how many fights I've been in, whether it was standing up for my sisters or just being the oddball and getting picked on. There was a lot of anger due to that pain. And at around 13, 14, I started to hit a growth spurt, because I was kind of this short, dumpy kid. And when I hit that growth spurt, at the same time, I kind of realized that if I am the meanest person that I know, then I can control how all of this goes, because no one's going to mess with the meanest person. What's the point of being kind and nice and forgiving? Because I think something really stood out to me at an earlier age when, I told my dad I was getting picked on. He's like, let's pray for those people. And in hindsight, yes, absolutely, right? I think what I needed to hear from my dad was something probably a little bit different.
Mm.
And so that really reinforced the idea of, Caleb, you are your own protector. Protect yourself. if you are violent, if you are mean, if you are the instigator, that the best defense is good offense. And so I think that is where I channel a lot of my pain. It turned into this ragefulness that simmered for a long time. I was violently angry a lot of times. And not so much like just raging, breaking things or whatever, but a slow, simmering rage built and built and built. You know, I had some outlets in music. I had a band in China. I had a lot of fun there. But, you know, when I was 13, I drank for the first time. And the thing about addicts and alcoholics is we didn't start off going, "Hey man, I'm gonna be a blackout drunk by the time I'm 19," right? That wasn't the thought process there. It was Chinese New Year's. All this other stuff that we just talked about is going on, and I was allowed to have a small bowl of rice wine to toast during Chinese New Year's. We're out in the country letting off fireworks. The feeling that I got, though, even just that slightest feeling that I experienced after doing so, I instantly had a desire for more.
Yeah.
Instantly. So I snuck down into the kitchen of this hostel we were at and essentially stole the whole kettle. And I got blackout drunk and got caught and, you know, a big ball of shame the next morning. And I swore I'd never do it again, right? That was terrible. And yet 2 months later, I'm throwing back more alcohol. And that's a repeated pattern in all of addiction, is that we swear off completely. Or we might even swear off, hey, I'm just going to not drink for a week or whatever it is. The inability to stay stopped. There's two things about addiction. Is one, when I start, I can't regulate the amount that I use or drink. And when I want to quit completely, I can't stay quit. As simply put, that is what addiction is.
Mm.
The thing is, though, alcohol is very effective. It numbs pain, and I had a lot of pain and anger. So once I started to abandon the idea that God cared about me, I then found ways to care for myself, if you will, through protectionism and through drinking. And it just started getting darker and darker. You know, a big part of my story, too, is music and how influential it was on my thought processes. And I really got into some bands and music that, you know, I would say have a very overtly dark message.
Yeah.
And it kind of became this psyche. What I didn't know at the time is that I was inviting darkness into my life. I didn't know that. I thought I was creating this kind of alter ego extension of myself that ran the show. What I didn't know is I was actively inviting darkness, spiritual darkness into my life and letting it take a foothold and then mold me from there on out.
It feels like that happens in teenage years when people are trying to find identity a lot.
Absolutely. You know, at least I would say out of the uncertainty of everything I was experiencing, there was some foundational things I could cling to. Like that at least gave me a sense of security because that wasn't changing, right? Like I could create this persona that I believed gave me power, and I could at least have something that I felt wasn't going to alter, wasn't going to change, that was safe. And, you know, darkness is never satiated, and it is so hard to describe the depravity of what I got into and where my mind and my heart took me in search of anything, really. Because I tend to be pretty cerebral in my thought processes, and from that comes a desire for knowledge, and you can find out a lot of things, and you can learn a lot of things in a very evil way, in an evil sense, a lot of dark stuff. and being ungrounded in the Lord, it can have a drastic effect. So the occult, that's occult with a O, occult. So yes, at first you want to feel good. And after a certain point, that evolved for me into, I desire power, and knowledge is power. I want power over people, I want power over places, and I want power over things. And it went from being this imperceptible, hey, yeah, I just want to be happy, to, no, I want to be the most evil version that I can be, because at the very least I have control over that. And if I actively engage in very dark things and dark knowledge, I will be given power. Right? If I give myself over to spiritual darkness, I will get something out of it. Which, you talk about blood pacts, you talk about, probably where I really went the furthest off the rails from a mental perspective and just kind of soul damage, if you will, was heavy uses of psychedelics, while at the same time doing all the research I could about the occult, the powers that run this world, the behind the scenes stuff that no one really talks about, how this world really operates, just stuff like that.
Really?
Oh, yes.
So it wasn't just, hey, I'm going to go numb the pain with substances and let the chips fall where they may. You are actively in pursuit of the knowledge of the things that run this world.
Correct.
That are found in Scripture.
Correct. And that was the biggest shift, because I think, prior to that, I was just kind of like a dog chasing after a car.
Yeah.
Just like, hey, I'm here in the moment. So let me give you a little background on that just to kind of flesh it out. So I came back to the U.S. when I was 17, went to school, dropped out of that, and then on and off, drug dealing, stuff like that. But then I became very successful with some of that. But my alcoholism also became very successful at overtaking my life. So I got married when I was 19. We're still married. I always tell the story, and then on the back end, people are like, well, are you still married? So I always have to throw that in now. We're still married. We got 2 beautiful kids.
But it wasn't a smooth road between 19 and today.
Oh, no.
But go ahead.
So there was a lot of really tough stuff that I put her through, and in the same sense of just kind of finding safety. She was trying to find safety out of me, which, that was a fool's errand. And so in 2011, we had a fight to end all fights. And I hopped on my motorcycle, and I just drove off. I was done. I was done with everything. I'd experienced a lot of financial success. I'd had experiences that you would read about in a rock and roll documentary or, biography. Some of the wildest experiences in the world, places that I'd gone, stuff like that. And I was completely and utterly unfulfilled. Everything was meaningless, and I was a slave to alcohol, and I knew it. So I decided as I drove away, and this wasn't like a, hey, babe, I'm leaving. This was literally one day I hopped on my motorcycle, and I'm like, I'm out. I just disappeared. But I decided that day that I was going to party harder. I was going to climb the drug network ladder higher than I'd ever gone before. That I was going to corrupt as many people as I could, just for the sheer sense of being able to have that power over them for the next year. And then on June 3rd of 2012, I was going to take a pistol and dig a hole, send in a letter that said I'd moved to Mexico, and I was going to shoot myself in the head out in the middle of nowhere. And that was going to be that. So that's when it became a very active pursuit of darkness. Because prior to that, it'd just been kind of like, hey, I'm getting through, getting by, drug dealing, sure. I mean, and it's insane, some of the stuff, even prior to this point, that I'd either experienced or done or whatever. I mean, but all of that aside, I still wasn't actively all in on the darkness. And once I decided to kill myself, I just knew that whatever I needed to do from then on to gain power, spiritual power, I would do. Whatever pact I needed to make, I would make. Whoever I needed to corrupt, I would corrupt. And from a personality standpoint, I would say that the feedback I get is that I can be very winsome relationally. And I absolutely use that to turn people into the worst versions of themselves. And that is when I started to delight in evil.
That's a different deal, man. A lot of people I have conversations with just didn't believe in God. There wasn't a spiritual life.
Right.
It was just what you can see and feel and touch and taste. And,
right.
And they thought that people who believed in God were kind of stupid, maybe,
Sure.
And a little superstitious and that sort of thing. That doesn't sound like you, though. It wasn't that you didn't believe in God. Believed in God. You were anti. You were opposite. You were on the other team.
Correct.
Purposely.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was for sure where I was at. And it was all, if you really want to chase down the rabbit trail, right? All fueled out of a sense of needing to belong, and in a sense of belonging, feeling safe. And when I feel in a sense of feeling safe, power, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of, you backtrack it, that's what worked for me then, right? That's what I thought was going to get me there, because I had experienced so much powerlessness at a young age that, like, at the very least, this is a sure thing. This faith thing in God is not a sure thing. And I look around and he's for sure let me down, much less other things that I've seen. So at the very least, even though this is a much more horrible road to take, at least I am the master of my own destiny. Even down to killing myself, at least I had control in that.
Yeah. I mean, you look at this whole thing, you think about when Jesus got baptized and he went in the wilderness and was tempted, right? His 3 temptations. One of the strongest temptations was for this power that you're describing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Satan himself says, hey, this world, these kingdoms have been given to me.
Yeah.
And I'll give you this power.
I'll give you dominion.
That's right.
Yeah.
It was offered to you, right?
Right.
And it sounded good.
Mm-hmm.
You took it.
Yeah. And man, this is the part where it gets a little, I would say, hard to believe for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But, I had some Satanists come over to buy drugs one time, and I had them draw a picture of the beast. And I made everyone that came into my apartment, they had to sign their name on it before I do business with them. I started to have weird conversations in my head, manifestations of, like, I was actively praying to the darkness, give me power, you can have my life, do whatever, right? And so that happens. It shows up to the degree that there were times where people who were not on drugs the next morning said, hey, what was the dark shadow in the room that had that big coat and a top hat? Like, what was that? It freaked us out. And I had been in a bed tripping on hallucinogens, because at the time I was growing commercial amounts of them. And so I was tripping on hallucinogens, and I was in a screaming match with a demon. And I remember it very vividly. I know exactly what it looked like. I know where it was standing in the room. I know what it was accusing me of and what it was saying. And I was open and closed eyes, same hallucinations, rolling around in this bed, sweating, having the battle of my life with this thing. But the thing is, obviously it's just the drugs, right, Caleb? But other people were like, hey, what was that? And that's when it changed from being a power thing to like, okay, this is kind of scary. Like, what is happening here? I could start to drive hours having conversations with whoever was in my passenger seat. 3 hours later I'd come to, and there's nobody in the seat. I was just talking to whatever. So, I started to lose connection with reality in a lot of ways. Or maybe I was more connected to reality, right? And those are the parts that are the most terrifying looking back, but at the same time that I weep out of gratitude for, because when we started, I said, hey, there's some depravity. Like, that state of mind of not okayness, of being afflicted like that, and being saved from that, is, God is so good that you can go so far away purposefully, and yet he says, no, you're mine, and I have something better for you.
It doesn't feel like a place that you're pulling yourself up out of.
Yeah.
By yourself.
Oh, no. You're in at that point. Because it's not something you...
That feels like a place where you got a team of people in prayer for you.
Yeah.
That's going to play a significant role in that happening. I don't know how all that works, man. And when I listen to you, my mind immediately goes to, just like probably a million other people, my mind immediately goes to, okay, what's the science behind that?
Totally.
Right? If Richard Dawkins, atheist Richard Dawkins, is sitting here listening to that, he's going to say, well, clearly he's a guy on drugs who's hallucinating and dreaming these things or wanting these things to be in his life, and so it's an hallucination. It's not an actual demon.
Mm-hmm.
How would you respond to that?
That's a good question. I've never been asked that question before. I've seen demonic possession in China, in rural villages. I guess the part of me the tether that I talked about, that Holy Spirit, if you will, that even though I tried to kill it, was still there. Even then, I was able to discern that this was evil, right? So I don't know from a scientific point of view that I can say anything other than, if we're going to go straight logic, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why non-hallucinating people are seeing the same thing unprompted that I am.
Yeah.
I don't know why people that were doing hallucinogens at another part of the city that I didn't talk to, both he and I experienced the same thing in the same places. I don't have explanations for those things, but I have enough people that were there that experienced it to know that it actually happened. This wasn't me recounting a solo adventure of my own where I'm the only point of reference to it. That's what's the freakiest thing about it, is like, it wasn't just me. There was other non-drug induced people there.
It's this break thing that has to happen for me, where we break from this mindset that the only things that exist are things that we can measure and see. This breaking from this mindset that there's no other reality.
Yeah.
And I hash this over and over again in my head, and I read and I study and I hear opinion and all these other things, and then it comes back to the experiences, I think, of people like you. And this isn't the first conversation I've had with non-unstable people, right?
Yeah, sure.
That are functioning in this world that say, and they come in with some hesitancy before they say it, but then they say, I can't keep this hidden because it's true. And I've mentioned this before. just the observation of things in the world. And I use the amoeba as an example. I wonder if the amoeba is aware of a consciousness that exists that's greater than itself.
Sure.
I wonder if it can conceive, if it could conceive at all of anything, of a consciousness on the scale of humans.
Sure. Absolutely.
You know, and then going smaller than that, there's actual bacteria that they eat that are 2 million times smaller than them. Can they conceive of? And so what in the world makes us think it stops with us? Because we can't see and measure something beyond what we can see and measure.
Absolutely. I just think that it is so limiting of this experience of life to think that what I see and experience is the sum total. Hey, if that's the case, then this kind of sucks.
Yeah.
You know?
It does. It does. But there are people, and I don't think it's self-fulfilling prophecy either. There are people who have had experiences on both sides of this. And it's interesting to hear yours on the darker side. And I believe we're going to probably hear some things on the non-dark side, on the light side as well. I've just talked personally to too many normal people who have seen things that are not natural in this world. And I don't know if science just says, hey, look, it's only unnatural because we hadn't explained it yet through natural causes.
Right.
And I think that's where science limits itself. And when I talk about breaking free of that, it's breaking free of the notion that everything is measurable by the tools we have now. Totally.
And I would submit to you this as well. When I say science, and when I hear you say science, I want to envision it as being the purity of what that actually means, science, and not the indoctrination of what this world says is true and not true, because that's a big blend of what a lot of people get beaten over the head with when it comes to the supernatural or even just common occurrences is, hey, what do the scholars say now about this? All right, well, that's the gospel truth. That is science now, right?
Yeah.
I'm, more from I think from an inquisitive point of view, testing and experiencing and experimenting. That's what I think of relative to science, not this branded conglomerate that kind of dictates what we get to know and not know, because that in of itself really kind of reeks of what I was pursuing in the first place, which is, hey, knowledge is power.
Yeah.
Right? But that's a whole nother topic we could get into.
Yeah. Science isn't a bad thing. Science is a great thing. I love what science delivers for us.
Absolutely.
I just get skeptical of scientists who only see the box of science as the only source of existence.
Totally.
Totally. And so I think it just limits us, and it's a fascinating thing to hear. I don't know that we've had anybody here who has actively pursued the darker side of spirituality. Mm-hmm. And so that pursuit and the things you encountered when you invited its existence in your life is really important to hear, I think. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anything else on that side of things? I mean, we don't want to get... I'm not fearful of any of it, but I don't want to glorify.
No, not at all.
But at the same time, surfacing other things like that might be important.
I think, it is important that you paint at least an accurate picture of where you came from, so it can further highlight where you are now.
That's right.
And I think just to cap off all of that, right? So I was homicidal, suicidal. I did not care. I had more money than sense at times and influence over people. From a worldly perspective, I probably should have been, quote unquote, very happy in some senses. I was the most miserable person I'd ever encountered. And towards the end, this slow cycle, I was drinking to maintain, just not shaking at that point.
Oh, yeah.
I was
physically shaking.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. Like horribly dependent from a physical perspective on alcohol. But in my mind, I was like, it's fine. June 3rd. I got an end date. And then some things happened. Right over here off of where we're sitting right now, 75, I got pulled over. I got issued a ticket for residue of marijuana. Not a big deal in my mind, whatever. 2 days later, I got pulled over in Sulphur Springs on Highway 30, with a lot more than residue, let's say, of a felony amount. Still, whatever, didn't care. About 2 weeks later, I got pulled over in Muskogee, Oklahoma, coming back from Colorado with a vehicle load, if you will, of marijuana and LSD. And I got thrown in jail there. And that was finally when my mom found out where I was. She'd been looking in online, like the morgue registries, hospitals, and finally my name popped up. I was in jail. She talked to the bail bondsman. He said, "Ma'am, this jail is not a very good jail, and it's one of the worst in Oklahoma to be locked in long term." And he said, your son's either going to come out of the jail either with a relationship with God, or he's going to come out angrier than you've ever seen him. I came out angrier than she'd ever seen me. And that's the time, and I think in the documentary it references it, but that's when my mom actually lost hope. She had been hopeful for a long time, but that's when she, in her mind, like, he's going to die. And this is how it's going to, like, he's beyond saving.
Yeah.
So I spent the last little bit of time. So that was in April of 2012.
So you're 2 months away from D-Day, right?
Right. Now, the reason I'd chosen June 3rd is because my sister was getting married a couple weeks prior to that, and I wanted to make sure that, should I be found dead or whatever, that it wouldn't ruin her honeymoon. So that was the kind of selflessness I was exhibiting.
So you weren't completely evil.
Right. I mean, just the sheer absurdity of that logic, right? So I was out of money at that point. There were still factions that were ready to, because I could move a lot of drugs, and so they were ready to just give me more. And at that point, I was even done with that. I just wanted to drink. So I went to the downstairs portion of my grandparents' double-tiered house. It's on a hill, so it's kind of the basement, but not really. And I just basically lived on a couch and drank for the next few weeks. Getting ready for the wedding. I was going to have a good time at the wedding, party hard there. Shortly thereafter, I was going to end it all. So at that wedding, 4 people walked up to me. 4 people from 4 walks of life that didn't necessarily know each other, that were different in so many aspects of the spectrum, like individually. Right, just completely, what is going on here? And they all kind of said the same thing. Hey, I just really felt like I was supposed to check on you. Okay, so that's kind of weirding me out. One of those people was Chris Peterson. And the thing that I'll remember probably till my dying day was this image of him saying, "Hey, if you ever need anything, just call." And then him grabbing my hand, shaking it, looking me in the eye and said, "In fact, you don't even need to call. You can just show up." And I was like, all right, this is all very weird. So I went on a hardcore drinking binge that night with some old friends I hadn't seen for a while. How people gather at weddings, right? So, I was just chugging hard alcohol. But in the wee hours in the morning, somehow the conversation turned to God. And there was just some cracks that I guess started to happen in the hard veneer that I created, right? The shell. Then I went to bed, tried to not think about it. 3 days before, well, technically a week before, 3 days before I got sober, or went to Dallas to get sober, I was sitting on my grandma's back porch, and I was drinking, and my dad was headed back to China the next day. So in my mind, I knew this was the last time I was going to see him. So I was just talking with him. And for whatever reason, one of the first big interventions happened here, and that God gave me a willingness to just listen. My dad and I, now, let me go backwards on this one. My dad currently is one of my best friends. He is an absolute role model of how I want to live my life as a believer, as a father, as a husband. That was never really the case before, okay? He and I were about as opposite on our stances as you could imagine, and I had a grudge, if you will, of I kind of superimposed both ways, right? I superimposed my experiences, my negative experiences with my heavenly father, my earthly father on my heavenly father, right? And we were just at odds. But for whatever reason, that night I listened. And we just started rather shallow. And it ended up to me asking some questions. And with a little filthier language, I basically said, how do you have peace? You've seen what I've seen. You've experienced what I've experienced. You've gone through stuff. How do you have peace? He said, son, my peace does not come from me. I decided a long time ago that I was going to put a stake in the ground, and that from henceforward I was not going to live for myself, but rather for the glory of God, and I was going to let him direct my footsteps, and that I didn't need to be in control. And from that came an insurmountable amount of peace. So it's not peace that I have created, but that's where it came from. And you got to understand, I could quote the Bible. Like, I was a missionary kid.
Yeah.
None of this was foreign to me, what he was sharing. But for whatever reason, it landed. He said, son, I just think of Matthew, basically a passage of Matthew. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. It says to cast your burdens upon me. He's like, son, that's not like gently letting go. God asks us to throw our burdens at him so that he can handle what we cannot. It also says to learn from me in that verse, and you will find rest for your soul. It was like a lightning bolt hit me. I finally understood what I had always wanted, what I'd always strived for, what I'd always desired, because I didn't have words for it up until this point. I needed rest for my soul. I desired rest for my soul. The white noise, the alarm clock of life, I turned all that down with what I was doing previously to this. And I suddenly realized that that was achievable from me not trying to be in control, but rather relinquishing to God and having rest for my soul. So that's kind of like starting to percolate in my brain. My dad looks at me and he says, son, I'm not trying to, sell you on anything. I'm a blind beggar, and I found the bread line, and I'm just trying to spread the good news. I love you. I'm going to bed. So he walks off the porch and kind of just leaves me there with that. So I'm still holding my alcohol, look up at the night sky. And this is the first palpable experience of being stricken by the presence of God, because in a nanosecond, what flashed before me and what I understood to a very great depth was I was not the sum total of my mistakes, nor the sum total of my successes or what I could be. I was irrevocably loved as I was. I was created with a purpose and loved more than I could understand. And that all the bad stuff and all the pain and all that was not what God desired for me, yet he was here for me. And if I would just accept that and embrace that there would be peace in that. And that sense of being loved and knowing it was so powerful that I immediately just burst into tears. And I understood right then and there on the back porch that my life was not mine anymore. I prayed to God right then, from here on out, whatever you desire of me is how I will do things. I give it all up. Please forgive me. I don't care if I'm in jail for the rest of my life. I don't care what things look like. I'm done doing this for me. Because here's the thing about all of it is, from a non-spiritual perspective, when we talk about recovery, there has to be absolute depravity. Absolute depravity in the sense that I'm so depraved that I have no choice over the alcohol, right? I knew without a shadow of a doubt, just from a recovery standpoint, that I was going to die with a bottle in my hand because I had thrown everything that I could into trying to not drink at times. And there was nothing that I had been able to manifest with any amount of success. So you couple that with a realization that I am loved and that like the only way out of anything ever is by faith through grace, right? Like that all happened in like 2 seconds. It was insane.
You don't seem like you were necessarily primed for that 2 days before.
Oh no. I wasn't primed for that afternoon.
It's not like you can see, oh yeah, he's coming around. And
oh no, there was no, there was an intellectual side that happened that night of drinking, and also realizing that the common denominator of the 4 people that approached me at the wedding, the only common denominator they had was that of a walk with Jesus, right? They professed Jesus as Lord.
Yeah.
So I noticed those things. But if you're talking about a shift in the heart, up until that conversation on the porch, like I was going to die with a bullet in my head in 6 days. So, you know, once you start messing with spiritual darkness, of course, there comes a lot of side effects, one of them being night terrors and just the most evil, wicked dreams that you could imagine. And so I got to the point, unless I was blackout drunk, I wasn't sleeping. And so I still drank that night.
You were having these.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's some of the crazy circumstantial things that happened. That morning, the next morning, I remember Chris Peterson saying, hey, just show up. At the same time, my sister informed me, hey, we're randomly just going to Texas. Right, completely random.
Yeah, you're in Arkansas.
I'm in Arkansas.
Chris Peterson's in Texas.
He said, just show up. And my sister, I had no idea. She was like, hey, we're going to go to Texas. So I was like, all right, well, I kicked alcohol before, the physical effects of it, and I was pretty physically dependent to the point that I knew how ugly it got when I was kicking alcohol as far as from a physical standpoint. So halfway to Dallas, I called Chris. I said, hey, man, I'm kind of taking you up on that. I'm headed your way. So first, my sister randomly was going. Secondly, Chris is never home on a Tuesday. Back in the day,
he's still rarely home on a Tuesday. I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So he was like, "Well, wild as it is, this is the first day in like a year or 2 years that I've been home on a Tuesday. So come on with it." So I get there. I'm like, "Hey, man, I need your back house. I need a bucket. I need some towels, a fan. I've got some benzodiazepine Xanax that I will taper myself off of, and it'll be probably about 96 hours of just leave me alone. If I live, I live."
Yeah.
kind of situation. He's like, all right, man. Well, he just wanted to be helpful, right? So, unbeknownst to me in the background, again, God bless all of the people that have prayed for me during this whole time, because there was an army of them, right? And so
and I can imagine if I had conversations with like your mom and Chris and others or whatever, I would be interested to hear, as you're describing these things, what they're doing at this time,
Right. Yes.
What's going on.
Right.
Behind the scenes, for sure. Anyway, go ahead.
So I think one of the most mature thing about my parents is at a very early age, for me, understanding that they were not the masters and commanders of my life, and that if I were going to change, it was not going to be because they foisted it upon me. So it's the age of, I think I was 17 or 18, I forget. They got on their knees and they prayed to God and said, God, we give you Caleb. He is yours. My mom still says it's one of the most scary prayers she's ever had to pray.
Yeah.
But they knew then that, like, it wasn't on them. Right? So they didn't take responsibility for my choices, which is very mature of them. They also did not try to pressure treatment or seeking help. They knew that if I were going to desire help, it would have to come from within. And so that, I think, is where they probably, I would say they're probably 10 to 15 years ahead in the process than a lot of families are.
Yeah.
They kind of arrived at that conclusion way earlier, and that was super helpful to me. Because when I was done, I was done. I was done. You know, I was looking at two to life in prison. Didn't know it at the time, but that's what the charges were going to be, 2 to life in prison. But I didn't say that prayer because I didn't want to go to jail. I was just done being the master and commander of my own little crappy existence, right?
Yeah, and you didn't, I'm speculating here, but it feels like the little cracks that opened up, it seems that like they maybe gave you at least a flash of hope.
Yes.
From where you were.
Yes. I think it unconsciously softened my heart a little.
Yeah.
Because I don't know if it was hope or not, but I think it was a gentling of the rage enough to where there could be some logical thought process.
A possible way out.
Yeah,
maybe?
yeah.
Maybe that's what yeah, okay.
So, you know, I get to Chris's, and this network of people has already sprung into action, and unbeknownst to me that there's already a place for me to go. None of this stuff I know. All I know is, like, today, must not drink, and then kind of get through the detox. So I'm about to roll into that the first night, and the phone rings. It's this guy that runs a sober home. He calls and basically says, hey, my suggestion is this: is you don't let that kid stop drinking. You let him keep drinking. Like, he's drinking way too heavily to try to quit on his own. We got to medically detox him. So if we take a step back from the God side of things, right? Well, this is still a God side of things, but just from a strict recovery standpoint,
yeah.
For the first time, it sounded like someone was speaking my language. I was like, that dude gets it.
Yeah.
He gets it. I mean, y'all are trying to help, but he gets it, right? Like, let Caleb keep drinking until he's in a medical setting, right? So right there, he got my buy-in.
Yeah.
I don't even know who this person is,
him.
but
yeah.
like, he obviously knows what's up.
He's been down this road.
So I was like, whatever he says, I'm doing. So Chris dutifully fed me tequila. Well, he gave me money so I could purchase tequila at Chili's while we're sitting there. But, you know, he dutifully did what he was asked to do, which I'm sure went against every part of fiber of his being, you know, but, you know, he was like, hey, I'm just doing what I'm asked here. But it kept me from detoxing long enough to get to Gaston House, run by Chico West. And I get there. I still have some Xanax on me because I'm thinking I have to detox myself. I get there, I go to the office, this dude turns around in a chair eating a fish taco. He's like, well, you want to be sober? I was like, yeah. So I gave him the pills and everything. He takes me into this group of 20 guys that lived there. He's like, hey, Caleb's been drinking today. We're going to get him to detox tomorrow morning. But he's been drinking today. Now he's going to stay here tonight. Does anybody have a problem with that? No one had a problem except for one guy. And I automatically was like, I hate that guy.
Yeah.
Right? The irony is, you know, the real estate agent that's going to be calling in a little bit, that's his wife. I was in his wedding. We're best friends. Like, God had a great way of, you know, just working out a lot of stuff. But anyways, the next morning they got me to detox. They gave me a beer on the way so I wouldn't withdraw. And I went to detox. I got out of detox. And I walked out of detox free in my heart, decision-wise, of knowing who God was, but also physically free from the effects of alcohol on June 3rd of 2012, the day that I had chosen to kill myself.
That was the day.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right. And so that was in itself a wild experience, but I think the next part is what sealed the deal in a good way. There's a gentleman, he lived in Beijing. He was also expat. When I was 14 years old, he met my dad randomly through some business stuff or whatever. He said, "Kirk, how can I pray for you?" My dad said, "Hey, can you pray for my son, Caleb?" So for 9 years, this man runs about 8 miles a day. He runs around the city of Beijing and prays. For 9 years, he prayed for me daily, every single day. Never met me, met my dad one time, but he prayed for me every single day. He randomly happened to be in town the day that I got out of detox. And because his mom had a hip surgery. So he flew back for it, because normally he'd never be in the U.S., much less Dallas, Texas. So he's talking to one of the guys that walked up to me at the wedding. And this guy was telling him, "Hey, man, Caleb Parette, you got sober. Things are changing." And he goes, "Well, if my understanding of the situation is correct, of what Caleb was actually involved in, unless we deal with the spiritual battle side of things, the dark entities, stuff like that Caleb actively dabbled in, it won't mean anything that he's sober now. He won't stay sober." So David Gowdy was the guy he was talking to, and I trusted David Gowdy just because I knew that he mentored my dad. And so I talked with him, and he said, "Hey, this is what this guy Rick Lehman said." He said that unless we deal with the spiritual stuff, it's really just a setup. And something immediately in me turned. An absolute wall of crippling, paralyzing, fight or flight, numbing, sweating fear swept over me. And I knew right then we had to do it, because that fear wasn't me. That fear was the darkness that I had invited into my life, realizing that there was about to be a reckoning. Unfortunately, we couldn't do it for another day or so.
When you heard this was in the moment. The second you heard the guy say, this is what he's saying we have to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right then.
Boom, like a shockwave.
It was like, you got to go.
Yeah. And then it subsided real quick. But the next morning when I woke up, I was almost hyperventilating with the amount of fear coursing through my veins. It felt like someone was clawing at the inside of my brain. And it was like the feeling that I needed to numb out when I was drinking, but prior to drinking, the antsiness, the not okayness, all that, like this amplified annoyance, whatever you want to call it, it was like that times 1,000 in waves. I was freaking out. So I talked to my counselor, Jared Fusen, and he got a strong walk with the Lord. And I'm thankful that my counselor was a Christian one, because he directed me to the Bible. And so I sat, and because we had to wait until everybody could get together, because there's like 7 people coming to all pray together. And so during that time, I don't know how many hundreds of times I recited and read and wrote down Psalm 23. Lord is my shepherd, shall not want, right? That kept me sane enough to not bolt, to not run. I can't quite emphasize how strong the urge was. The absolute revulsion of just run, get away. Like a cornered animal is what it felt like.
Really?
Yes.
Because if you just think about it, it's just going to be a group of people praying over you, right?
Right.
What's the big deal?
Yeah, exactly. So we meet at this office, Chico's office. I'm in a chair, and there's a table in front of me, and everyone's sitting around the table. So not to get too deep into it, but just a slight overview, how demonic stuff works, and it's all very legalistic. There's rules and regulations to all this. I didn't know this on the front. So Rick Lehman kind of laid it out for me. He's like, look, it's like landlord, squatter type stuff. Like there's certain ways like things roll when it comes to spiritual stuff, to where it's really it's not this huge power struggle necessarily. It's really more of a court hearing where certain decrees are ordered, and that's just what happens, because you don't like that. The darkness does not have dominion over the light. Right.
Definitely.
And so he's like, it's really more like a legal proceeding more than anything. And so I was like, okay, that makes sense. And so we kind of roll into it, and he went through kind of 6 renditions of invoking the power of the Holy Spirit to call forth the presences that I'd invited into my life. And there was 6 of them, each with its own name, each with a list of things that it had influenced me to do. And this is where it's so kind of out of left field that even the guys that were there, they met the next day and chronicled everything from everyone's perspective and wrote it down, because they're like, we got to have an accounting of this. Like, it was so intense.
Yeah.
There's a gentleman that was there. His name's Gil Sheehan, and just another pillar in my life. Man, God's just blessed me with so many awesome men to look to in my life. But he describes it as, I was wearing a button-up shirt, and the second that the darkness surrounding me, right? Because I don't think I was possessed, because I did have the Holy Spirit, right? But I was very oppressed. There was passengers there. And so the second that they started to address the darkness directly, Gil described it as, and for me, you got to understand, like, this whole process, it's like I was seeing it in a first person and third person point of view at the same time in a hazy fashion. I don't know how to describe it other than that. It was like I was 2 perspectives at once. But Gil describes that once they started to address the darkness directly, you could almost see a wave of sweat instantly drench the front of my whole shirt, washing down, like just going rigid, tense.
You went rigid.
Yes. And my voice became gravelly and growling as they addressed all this stuff. And every muscle in my body was tensed, like flexed to the max. And now when I went in for this thing, it was a sunshiny day like we see right now. I couldn't tell you how long it lasted. At the time, it felt like an eternity, and it felt like 30 minutes at the same time. But 4 hours later, the last of the garbage had been dealt with. And I collapsed on the table weeping, sobbing, because I knew, like what Jesus said on the cross, it is finished. Like I knew it was over. You ever read that book, The Pilgrim's Progress? Old, I think 1700s book. But Little Pilgrim's Progress, basically he's carrying this burden. It's a story about him on his journey to heaven and how the burden finally gets cut away, right? The same thing, like a physical weight dropped off of me that weighed 1,000,000 pounds that I didn't know was there until it was gone. Like I even feel it right now, like the ability to breathe again. I could, like, it was so oppressive but I had no idea that it was there until it was gone. So when it lifted, it was so shocking. And I was so grateful that I collapsed on the table just bawling and bawling. The men around me were crying. And then Rick says, "Hey, we're gonna pray over this room, why don't you step outside and get some fresh air? Now, I had walked into this office when it was completely bright and sunny. I walked out, and an absolute brutal thunderstorm was raging. And there was no cars on the street, nothing. Lightning's flashing, absolute torrential downpour. And I mean, just like Shawshank Redemption at the very end when he finally escapes the prison. Like, I knelt down in the middle of the street with crashing thunder and lightning and getting drenched to the bone with my hands raised up to the sky, crying and rejoicing at the same time, thanking God that it was finally finished, that he had saved me from all that. I didn't deserve it, but just so grateful.
A physical manifestation of the spiritual life in real time with multiple witnesses. I just don't know how you deny that. I don't know how you manufacture that in the natural world.
For sure. And I mean, and we're not talking about your average ham and egg or Joe Blows. I mean, everyone in that room was either successful from a worldly standpoint of business. I mean, these are all well thought out, logical men who, like, you know, that they had earthly success as well. That these weren't just like a bunch of other missionaries that were all chanting Kumbaya together and believed the same thing. I mean, these were guys that were in the world but not of it.
Yeah.
And they all experienced the same thing.
You know, one of the questions I ask a lot of people, because I like to hear the different answers. I know what I respond to this question with, but what causes you to believe that God actually exists? Yeah. Is it that? I mean, do you point to something so supernatural happening in your life that it's like, that's almost a silly question now?
So, well, I mean, hey, that was the crescendo, right?
Yeah.
But you asked me why or why I think God exists, or how I know it.
Yeah.
Sure, the crescendo plays a part in that. But the mindset of evil that does not pervade my every thought and action now, but rather is seen as what it is, which is evil, and not something to be delighted in. Like, Stacey, I was violent. I rejoiced in violence. The thought of hurting people. Like, you got to understand the occult is anything that is good. The verse, what is good is lovely. Think about these things. Like, if you took that and made an opposite list, that is how you are supposed to think in the occult, yet portray that you aren't that way. That is the goal. And so that is completely what I was wrapped up in my thoughts and my actions, and to see that is not what I'm imprisoned to anymore, overarchingly.
Yeah, the degree of transformation.
Yeah, from that's why I led this thing off. I was like, you have to understand the depravity to see what you were saved from. And there's a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary. She says, and I love this. She says, we don't know all that we were saved from.
Yeah.
Meaning, like, yeah, sure, Caleb, you know that you were saved from all that. What about all the stuff you don't know that God saved you from? Like, we have no clue.
It's scary to think about. It's also comforting to think about, too.
Totally.
They had names?
Yes.
Do you just not even bring that up?
What do you mean?
I mean, what are they?
I'd have to look at the written down ones.
Yeah. Do you remember any of them?
Yeah. Addiction was one, and death was another one. Like, those were the two big ones that I remember at the time. The spirit of death.
Yeah. I had a guy on here who had experienced deliverance a couple times, and one guy looked at him. He said, the guy was looking at me, and he said, are you mockery? And like the guy, this gravelly voice came out.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, yes, or whatever. And he had to be, and it was a spirit of mockery. It was, this guy was in a place where that's just him humiliating other people.
Yeah.
Was his deal.
Well, and that goes back to the legalistic nature of it is.
But hey, man, this sounds so 16th century.
Totally.
Doesn't it?
Totally. And you know, it's a bit of a cliche, but the greatest trick devil ever pulled was convincing the world he doesn't exist, right? But
yeah,
the world as we see it now screams, you don't need God because there is no devil.
Yeah.
Self is all, right? That the thought of talking about stuff like this is just so foreign to so many people. I equate it to when someone's not ready to hear the truth, regardless of what it may be, whatever setting you need, right? If a person is not ready to engage in truth, when they hear something that pushes against their paradigm of security, you can watch a glaze go over their eyes because it's like, will not interface with that, right? Like, so it's kind of like that for most people, I would say. But here's the thing: I'm going to Indonesia next week. There's no doubt over there with the people there that there's demonic stuff.
Yeah,
like, they know.
Yeah.
Right, like
that's true. I've heard others that have gone to other countries and say, "Hey, man, we see some stuff that would, if you did at the big church downtown,
right,
it would carry out, you know."
Right.
But that it's understood, and it's not manufactured.
Yeah.
It is real, man.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also the Bible does talk about the world being divided up into different kind of zones, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And there's different demonic principalities that govern each zone, if you will. That's their little dominion that they get to have influence over, right? And so there's all kinds of different flavors of sin that they revel in. And some of it's far more covert and intellectual.
Yep.
And some of it doesn't have to be. It can be very overt, depending on where it is in the world.
So this is what, 5 years ago? 6 years ago?
It'd be 10 years.
10 years ago.
In a couple weeks.
Wow.
Yeah.
How have you experienced the presence of God since then?
I just think of that hymn, Blessed Assurance, Jesus is mine. And sure, there's the tangible stuff. There's the tangible things of, hey, I got probation instead of going to jail on something that's a whole nother thing that I should have been in jail for a long time.
Yeah.
Sure, there's those tangible things. There's the tangible things of my wife and I getting back together.
Yeah, because there's a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah.
If we were to cover your full story,
yeah,
it'd be like 7 episodes. So anyway, go ahead. Yeah, presence of God.
Yeah, there's the tangible stuff of becoming a father for the first time.
Yeah,
and then a second time with my youngest. There are all those things, but more so now is the blessed assurance that Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. There's a peace that I experience now in the tumultuousness of this world, that everything in this world is, from my experiences, be fearful, right? To induce panic, to induce fear, to induce distrust, whether it's through political, economical, or whatever situations, life itself, dealing with overdosing guys in a sober home, whatever you want to call it. I know God's real because I have peace now. I'm able to sleep. And with a gentle assurance, know that like my place is set, and that the real King loves me, and I don't have to be anything more than who He created me to be, which is someone who loves Him. and lives accordingly, it's just, my life is so much simpler in a lot of ways.
The presence of God is the indwelling you experience on a daily basis. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because it's just the sheer lack of panic.
Yeah, it's contrasting it with how severe it was in the opposite direction.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And I've been through tough stuff since. It's not like it's been,
Right.
But it's that blessed assurance.
Yeah. You talk about tangible things that you see in the world, and people have different experiences, and miraculous things happen to people that aren't explained in the natural world, and you've had your own experiences with that stuff, especially in your deliverance. I mean, I think it's highlighted. I think it's probably a very abrupt breaking in when you experience stuff like that, and if you don't believe that the spiritual life exists, you go through something like that, and you probably don't ever unsee that. It's kind of like Paul on the road to Damascus. I mean, he had something so reality shaking happen to him that he's like, I'm forever. I mean, there's nothing that can change that.
So the flip side of knowledge is power, right? When you look at it from a heavenly perspective in the presence of God, it's hard to unknow that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's right. You can't. So what is your daily walk like with God now?
I mean, I'll be the first to tell you that I struggle with church settings because I grew up in them.
Yeah.
So I think, but I'm grateful for the recovery aspect of my relationship with God, because the Big Book makes it very simple how we kind of engage in quote-unquote spirituality. Now, that's great for just being recovered, but when we talk about having a walk with the Lord, right, obviously it goes far deeper than that, and it's far more reaching than just that. But the idea behind a individual relationship with God that the Big Book talks about was very helpful for me on the front end, because there's a lot of jadedness that I experienced through supposed Christians, or whatever you want to call it, broken people in a broken world, that I then superimposed onto God's character.
Yeah.
Right? Which, that's a very common theme all around. But I never really went to church. Growing up, we had house church, and so my walk now is more of one of, it's very, very internal on a daily basis, and there are, from a discipleship point of view, there are probably 5, 6 of a lot of the same guys actually that I stay connected with, just on spiritual stuff and prayer. Like, that's my top down community. And then the guys that I got sober with, it was kind of wild. Those 2 years. So I was in sober living for 6 months. From that time onwards, for about 2 years, the number of guys that came to know Jesus at that Gaston house was unlike we'd ever seen before, because I ended up running Gaston house for years after that, after I got my counseling degree and stuff. But that little period of time, some sort of revival happened.
Yeah.
And so a lot of those guys, I'm brothers in Christ with, right? Like that. Those are the guys I pray with, I do life with, stuff like that. So I think more than anything now, my walk with God is one of, I kind of have to reaffirm, like, hey, you got this, or God's got this, right? God's got this. God got it. There's a lot of stuff I've never, I kind of got a late start on life in a lot of ways. And so there's a lot of things that, even being a dad late, graduating school late, getting a house late, there's a lot of things that, like, I haven't navigated before in life, either from a growing up overseas perspective or from an addiction perspective, that I think God has gently walked me through and given me assurance of just like, hey, we could look at the track record, which is pretty stellar, and you can continue to walk in faith. But, my middle name's Thomas, and I think that's what really, I get in my head about that, because it's like, Caleb, yet you have seen all this, and yet you can still doubt.
Yeah.
Yet you can still doubt.
Yeah.
But he's so faithful to come back on the back end of that and be like, and here's why you don't need to. whether it's what I wanted to happen or not, right? Like the outcome is totally separate of the assurance that Jesus is mine.
Do you carve out time that's devoted to God every day? I know it sounds, when you talk, it sounds like it's just an ongoing thing, but are there things that you do to stay connected, to stay in this abiding thing?
So whether it's time of prayer or a big one for me is music.
Yeah.
Like still, like being able to sing unabashedly to my Creator. It's not about the song itself, but that the moment in of itself, the freedom, I would say, to just worship, connect, and pray. It's something so special to me because music has always been such a huge part of my life. To be able to have that kind of relationship with God where I'm praying and actively singing out loud, that's a huge part for me.
It's different for people, and I've talked to a lot of people, and music is a big part of it or whatever. And I'm a huge music person, but it sounds weird. I don't listen to a lot of traditional Jesus music. I have a Jesus playlist, but it's got stuff like Bob Marley and Allman Brothers, and
very few of the songs that I listen to are you would say like Jesus songs.
Yeah. There's nothing, and it's just different for different people.
Totally, but here's the deal: like God's truth, like the truth is God's truth, and so when you have someone who's writing a song, whether or not they know the Lord, like
yeah, that's right.
Like intrinsically, the truth of what they're speaking about, whether it be about love or whatever, like it all goes back to all truth is God's truth. Yeah. So if what they're saying is true, right, then like. Right there, it
just reflects God.
Totally.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's cool. I like to hear what people do to stay connected to God, and I think it's a big deal. And I think about your situation, and you got into a place that not a lot of people get to, but you got to a place that people have been. I wonder, do you ever feel a tap on the shoulder from those guys?
Oh, totally. From time to time. Yeah. Even this week, the music from before.
Yeah.
Right. I just miss some of the music from time to time. Like that was even this week.
Mm-hmm.
But never to the degree like I haven't drank or smoked or whatever in 10 years, right? Like there's to a degree like the actions have never happened. But have there been little fish hooks of past BS? Absolutely.
What do you do?
Oh, you pray and you confess. Call my friend and say, hey, there was a tough situation that someone very close to me went through. And it was a situation in which I could eradicate the problem with a phone call. And the rage that built up to me because of the injustice done was blinding. And I just am really grateful that part of the 12-step process is you pause when agitated or doubtful. And that gave me enough time to talk to people in my life. I need God-fearing people in my life to touch base with because that stuff will come up.
Yep.
And I cannot stress how tempting it was to solve this problem permanently for someone that I love dearly with just a phone call. But it would have involved such evil things and such a reversion to who I used to be that I'm just glad that was probably the most dire example of it.
Yeah.
But even, hey, let's not even go that extreme, right? Like the music you listen to, the inputs you have, what you choose to look at. I mean, how you choose to shepherd your employees, how you choose to treat the people around you. Are you going to engage in a loving way that emphasizes care, empathy, and connection? Or are you gonna use people as the tools that you used to see them as in order to gain what you want? I mean, like it runs the full spectrum.
Yeah.
But
how far are you going to carry that thought?
Yeah.
that just popped into your head.
Totally.
That happens to me a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, how far am I going to carry that thought? Are we going to cut that off now, or are we're going to ride it for a little while? It's innocent enough.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that's the oh man, marijuana being a gateway drug, and that's a whole discussion of its own or whatever. But I will say this: it is one of the most destructive things in my life because it was so insidious.
Yeah.
So the parallels from marijuana addiction and what it actually did to my brain and how debilitating it was to the pernicious whisperings of the devil, if you will, are exactly the same, because it never starts off as, hey, let's mainline this rig of heroin. It's always like, just smoke a little weed. Same thing with how the enemy attacks. It's never going to be a front. Well, I shouldn't say never. Rarely will it be a full frontal attack, because he's had to change up his tactics.
Yeah, he's not sneaking up on you that way.
Right.
Yeah. It's cool and interesting to talk about the spiritual life in such tangible ways, and I think that's one of the reasons we do this, is so you can have frank discussions about the truth.
Yeah.
Instead of burying it or sweeping it under the rug, and it gives people a chance to hear things without sort of the emotion of different perspectives, and we can just have a couple of guys having a conversation about the spiritual life and the truth of it and what you've experienced and what deliverance really looks like. And like I said before, in the world of addiction is some of the places where I feel like I have spoken to people who have had some of the most pronounced encounters of darkness and light.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's good to talk about them. And I think they occur in lots of other forms, whether it be in marriages, relationships. It doesn't have to be just addiction. It's so many other things. I think people will recognize the spiritual warfare and battle that takes place regardless of the circumstance. It's just highlighted and sometimes exacerbated, I feel like, in cases of addiction, in my experience, at least anyway.
The thing about addiction is this: it has the most tangible consequences that are the most dire, the most quickly, most of the time, right? Like, you're not going to see people necessarily fall out from having a porn addiction or workaholism or corporate worship, whatever you want to call it, right?
Yeah.
Sure, there's long-lasting terrible effects of all those things, but addiction kind of forces our hand.
Yeah.
You're either going to accept God as a way out.
I guess that's probably
or
right?
You're going to die.
Yeah.
So which one's it going to be, right? And here's the thing. Stacey, it wasn't the consequences. It was not the consequences that got me sober. I'll go one further than that, because yes, that can start people thinking, right? Like, hey, I want to get sober. If you watch the documentary, I've shot through a roof while screaming at my wife. I've lost friends. I have lost people in my life. There's just been terrible, terrible, terrible consequences. And I was still just going to kill myself rather than try to ask for help and quit drinking. God interceded in such a way that I saw that the only way out was Him, and because I didn't have any more tricks up my sleeve. Like, it is when I say the realization of depravity, it is the realization of powerlessness.
Yeah.
Utter powerlessness is what brought me to that point. Right? The consequences were kind of a garnish, if you will. But the true, the fulcrum and lever of change, if you will, like that pivot point, was utter powerlessness from myself.
Yeah. If you had to bottle it up in a message, do you have a message?
That's like, I don't know that I've ever been asked that, and I don't know that I have a message. What I do have is, I have a story. You gotta stump me on that one, Stacy. Because here's the thing: I could trot something out, that sure is a message, but do I have a message?
Yeah, I mean, there's something in you that, and I feel like you've said it in what we talked about today, that if you were having a conversation with somebody who's like, I don't know about this spiritual life stuff, I'm not sure about this God thing. I'm just trying to survive. I'm doing my life, and I mean, you've been into the depths pretty hard, and have a perspective that most people don't really get a chance to experience.
Mm-hmm.
Usually, people of faith, when it's become their own, have experienced something, and the reason they go and tell other people about it is because it's so transformative and real. There's nothing in it for them. You just want other people to know.
Man, I think something that I would say is a message from me that I really, really believe in is God does not make too hard of terms for those that seek him. And that to anyone that is saying, hey man, I'm good on this God thing and all that, like, okay, but have you sought at all? At all? Have you asked questions? Because I know for a fact that God, like the Father in the prodigal son, he runs to us when we seek him with open arms. And so my, I guess, message would be like, hey, God doesn't make too hard of terms for those who seek him. And have you sought at all? What are some things that, like, you would want to seek if that were the case? Because I don't think that, well, I do know that, like, God fills in those cracks. It's not because of stuff that you and I do when we talk to people, right? Like, it's God's message through that. And I believe as long as someone is willing to ask the questions, that God will find a way to meet them there in that. May not get a direct answer immediately, but God runs to us in that way.
Yeah, that's cool. That's a big deal in that parable. The dad didn't just go get him while he was still mired in his stuff.
Yeah.
The kid had to turn.
Exactly.
But the moment he turned and was walking, he still had his head down. Dad came from a long way off. And that's a big deal, because when I hear people that don't believe, one of the thing that I feel like is missing for them versus people, like I've said before, other addicts that I've talked to just didn't believe in God. But they got to a point where they said, okay, if you are real, and I don't believe you are, but if you're real. And the second that happened, he broke in. In different ways. But I don't think he's playing hide and seek with you.
No.
You know what I'm saying?
No.
And I think your point is really important there. The thing that I feel like unbelievers are missing, and people that are, point to the scientific where you break things into parts, is they just don't believe that stuff is real, but they've never sought.
Yes.
They've never truly sought.
Yeah.
They've investigated from a distance, but they've never gone to him and asked him and reached for him. And I think that's what I would challenge them to consider at some point. Because after truly in your heart reaching and seeking him, that's when he breaks in. That's when it happens. And he's faithful. And he says, you ask for the Holy Spirit, be careful.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to give it to you.
Yeah.
And he's not playing hide and seek. And I would encourage people, at that point, then you can say, okay, now I've experienced this side and this side. I'm going to stop making declarations about the side that I've not experienced before.
Sure.
And now I can say, all right, I've experienced this side and this side. And for me, I can say that. I've experienced this side and this side. And I've yet to talk to somebody who has genuinely experienced the side where they reached out for God and say, what a waste of time that was.
Right.
What a mistake that was.
Sure. Well, and just also the paradoxical nature of being so averse to something you don't even believe in.
Yeah. That should tell you something.
Like, what's the big opinion here? You don't believe in it.
Yeah.
It just is a non-issue.
Yeah. That's what they're missing. I love that. I think that's a big deal, is to reach out.
Yes.
Yeah. Caleb Parette, man. Sometimes these things happen quickly and sometimes they don't. And the fact that you and I were able to reconnect over and over again, and then for some crazy reason it just sprung up in front of us for today, those are tangential evidence for me of the existence of God, and I can't help but smile and celebrate it. And so for you to have such a heart to share your experiences in the depths of which you have is a big deal. And man, I can't tell you how much I appreciate it.
Look, man, I thank you for the kind words. One, two, like, I don't necessarily lead with that when I meet most people, but at the same time, if this in any way like bolsters someone's decision to ask or reach out, it's like, what a gift! What a gift that God would be so kind to take a wreck of a human and make him useful, and being able to be of service in any way. Like, what a gift that I don't deserve. That, like, God is just good, man. God is so good.
I can't imagine the guy from 12 years ago saying something like that.
No, not at all. No, not at all.
He is good. It's amazing. And man, what a treat for me to be able to sit across from you here in your town and have this conversation. And I just really appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely, man. Thanks for having me on.
I don't know how anyone can listen to that story and continue to dismiss the spiritual life and the presence of God. And that was just from Caleb's perspective, with nothing from the dozens of other witnesses. To quote Caleb's mother, quote, "It's a miracle that Caleb isn't dead, and it's a miracle that he walked away from that life." A primary purpose of this podcast is to be a stage for God to shake people into the awareness of the truth of God's existence, His power, and love. A truth that far too many people dismiss as simply a concept, a religious theory, or a potential lifestyle to live to whatever degree we feel comfortable living it. But if what Caleb or anyone else we've interviewed in these first 50 episodes has shared with us is true, we had better stand up and reach for the presence of God like we never have before, because I promise, nothing is more important. I have to thank Caleb for sharing with the depth he shared in this conversation. There is no motivation for him in this world to do such a thing. But the fraction of the experiences he chose to share with us today are an amazing testament to the depths in which God's hand extends to save us. Thank you for joining us today on A Stronger Faith. If you'd like to see the documentary featuring Caleb and his family along with several others in recovery, please visit askdocumentary.com. I've seen it a couple of times and it's outstanding. For more episodes like this one, to recommend a guest, or to support this podcast ministry, please visit astrongerfaith.com. Until next time, we pray for peace in your life and a stronger faith for you and those you love.